Bonjour, good day. Tomorrow we'll be debating our Opposition Day motion, and the Opposition Day motion that we're putting forward that we've already tabled, that we'll be debating tomorrow, is in relation to the horrific discovery of the 215 Indigenous children at a grave or at a burial buried underneath a former residential school in Kamloops. What we're asking for is to acknowledge that though we are reeling with the horror of this discovery, it's not a surprise. This is something that we've known about, that Indigenous children were stripped from their homes, stripped of their language, their identity, and the goal was to kill Indigenous people. And it's clear that that's what's happened at this residential school. So our opposition motion is to call for concrete action. It is not enough for Justin Trudeau to say that he shares his condolences when he is currently fighting Indigenous kids in court, when he is currently fighting survivors of residential schools in court, when he continues to fail to implement the calls to action from the TRC. So we are laying that out in this opposition day motion. Our motion lays out very clearly. We are demanding action and concrete action in light of this horrible moment. This should be a moment for us to not just reflect on the pain and the trauma, but then to do something about it. It's not enough to just reflect on the pain and trauma without doing something concretely. And so that's what we're asking for. So our opposition motion will lay out key requests. One, to immediately cease the belligerent and litigious approach to Indigenous children by immediately dropping its appeal before the federal court. Right now, there's an appeal before the federal court. We're asking this Liberal government to drop that appeal. Secondly, we are asking the Prime Minister to sit down with the St. Anne's residential school survivors and work with them to find a solution. Access to justice has been denied as a consequence of the government's lawyers. So we're asking this Liberal government to cease the legal proceedings and to work to a resolution without fighting these survivors in court. We're asking the Liberal government in this motion to accelerate the Truth and Reconciliation Commission's calls to action. There's only been 12 out of 94 that have been implemented. We are calling on this government to implement all 94 calls to action. This motion will also call for this government to provide survivors, their families, and their communities with the supports they need to deal with the trauma, to assist them with the emotional, physical, spiritual, mental, and cultural trauma resulting from residential schools. And finally, we're not going to leave this open-ended. We want to see within 10 days a progress report on these specific items. We want action and we want it immediately. That is what justice demands. Justice demands action, and that's what we're fighting for. Donc, demain, on va avoir un débat sur notre journée d'opposition. Et dans notre journée d'opposition, on veut voir des actions concrètes pour répondre à la découverte horrible de 215 enfants autochtones enterrés à une ancienne pensionnat à Kamloops. C'est important de pleurer la perte de ces enfants, mais pour le gouvernement fédéral, c'est plus important qu'il prenne des actions concrètes pour régler les injustices. Et on a des injustices de maintenant qui continuent. Et donc, dans notre journée d'opposition, on demande au gouvernement d'arrêter tout de suite de poursuivre les enfants dans les cours en justice. À ce moment, ce gouvernement libéral, Justin Trudeau, poursuit les enfants autochtones au niveau d'appel fédéral, de Cour de justice fédérale. On demande qu'il arrête de faire ça. On demande que le gouvernement libéral arrête de poursuivre les survivants des pensionnats, en particulier de Sainte-Anne, et qu'il arrête tout de suite de poursuivre ces survivants et au lieu de ça, de trouver une solution sans avoir une bataille dans la cour. Et en plus, on demande que le gouvernement accélère la mise en œuvre des calls to action pour le TRC, qu'il faut le faire tout de suite. Et finalement, d'aide pour les survivants, pour les familles, pour les communautés frappées par les pensionnats. On demande que le gouvernement fournisse l'aide, l'appui pour les communautés, pour les gens, pour les familles. Et on sait que le gouvernement souvent dit oui ou donne des belles paroles, mais ça prend trop de temps. Ça fait 6 ans maintenant que les communautés autochtones ont demandé des actions concrètes et le gouvernement n'a pas agi. Donc, on demande aussi d'avoir un rapport pour montrer le progrès en 10 journées. Donc, ça, c'est notre demande pour notre journée d'opposition demain. Thank you. With that, I'm ready to take any questions you might have. Merci.
Thank you. We will now proceed to questions. We will start with questions on the phone. Journalists can ask one question and one follow-up. Merci. Nous allons prendre des questions. Nous allons prendre des questions au téléphone. Les journalistes pourront demander une question et une question de suivi. Opératrice, nous allons une première question.
Merci. Veuillez appuyer sur étoile 1 pour poser une question. Please press star 1 to ask a question. Notre première question est de Raymond Fillon de TVA. À vous la parole. Please go ahead.
Merci beaucoup. Bonjour, M. Singh.
Bonjour.
Puisque vous parlez et vous demandez des actions concrètes, il y a la ville de Charlottetown cette semaine qui a retiré la statue de Sir John A. Macdonald à la suite de la macabre découverte à Kamloops. Est-ce qu'à votre avis, le fédéral devrait faire la même chose, retirer les statues, l'image de M. Macdonald des billets de banque?
Je pense que c'est une question importante. Et comme j'ai dit ailleurs, je pense qu'il y a dans les milieux publics, dans les endroits publics, on doit avoir une sensibilité pour reconnaître c'est quoi le message envoyé par les statuts. Donc, avec les statuts comme tels, comme John A. Macdonald, c'est clair que ça envoie un message négatif à la communauté autochtone parce que c'était un des gens qui était fondateur de des pensionnats. Et on sait clairement que les pensionnats étaient mis en œuvre par exprès pour éliminer les communautés autochtones. C'était un acte de génocide. Donc, je pense qu'il y a une place dans les musées pour reconnaître l'histoire, pour avoir des objets comme ça où on peut garder dans les musées pour se rappeler de l'histoire, de notre histoire comme pays. Mais dans les places publiques, peut-être ils ne sont pas utiles et plus que ça, ils blessent les gens. Donc, dans mon avis, on doit créer des milieux qui sont inclusifs, qui disent bienvenue aux gens. Et il y a des statuts qui amènent des impacts négatifs, qui amènent un message négatif aussi. Donc, c'est important de toujours réfléchir de comment on peut créer, comment on peut bâtir une société qui est plus juste et plus inclusive.
Donc, on devrait retirer les statuts, on devrait retirer également le nom de M. Macdonald des autoroutes, des aéroports fédéraux et de l'immeuble où le gouvernement tient régulièrement ses points de presse sur la colline. C'est ce que vous dites, c'est ce que je comprends.
Je dis que c'est une discussion importante et je reconnais l'importance d'avoir des places publiques qui sont inclusives. Et dans notre histoire, comme les États-Unis ont fait, ils ont retiré quelques statuts parce que ces statuts amènent une histoire négative d'esclavage. Donc, ils ont décidé d'enlever ce sorte de statuts des gens dans l'histoire qui ont appuyé l'esclavage. Donc, dans notre cas ici au Canada, c'est clair que la communauté autochtone a été frappée fort par les actes génocidaires du Canada, en particulier les pensionnats, mais plusieurs autres institutions qui étaient là par exprès pour éliminer la communauté autochtone. Donc, la question d'éliminer ces sortes de statuts, ces sortes des images dans des places publiques pour rendre les places publiques plus inclusives, c'est une importante discussion et j'appuie l'idée de rendre nos places publiques, nos endroits publics, nos institutions plus inclusives. Donc, j'appuie cette idée et je suis prêt de travailler ensemble pour réaliser cette idée.
Prochaine question au téléphone.
Merci. Our next question is from Cormac McSwaney from Steady News. Please go ahead. À vous la parole.
Hi, I'm just wondering about the announcement from the federal government today that it is now opening up the $27 million and will be informing Indigenous communities how they can access those funds that were promised first back in the 2019 budget in order to search former residential school sites for more remains and unmarked graves. Do you think it's enough for the federal government to just open up this funding and allow these communities to access the funds to conduct these searches? Or do you think there's more that needs to be done? And if so, what exactly, on the searches alone, what exactly should the federal government be doing that it hasn't done?
First off, the Liberal government had the calls to actions for over 6 years. They could have put in place this call to action specifically 6 years ago. So it's 6 years too late. The second component is we want to make sure, and what we've called for is that the federal government be partnering with Indigenous communities that want this help. If a community needs or wants this help, they should be supported. It shouldn't be passive that the government says, oh, there's money there, you can apply for it. The federal government needs to help. And to put it in blunt terms, it is the government of Canada that created this system, the residential schools, created a system that was designed to kill Indigenous people. And the government has a responsibility, Canada has a responsibility to help in seeking closure for Indigenous communities. One step of healing is that closure that comes from finding out what happened. And in doing that, the federal government has to play an active role, a partnership, a supporting role in helping communities that want to go down this path. It should be led by Indigenous communities, but the federal government should partner with and support that initiative if a community chooses to do so.
That's essentially what the government did say that they would be doing today. But on a different topic, not slightly different topic, slightly different angle on this.
Sure.
The Catholic Church still has not released, a lot of the records that they have around these residential schools as families continue to search for answers. The government today said that Catholics should be asking their church to do better. They're demanding an apology from the Vatican, from the Pope again. But we haven't seen action in a number of years from the Catholic Church. What more can be done to get access to these records to find answers for these families who need those answers?
Well, one, I just want to start off by reflecting on how painful that is for a family that right now doesn't have answers, that doesn't know what happened to their loved ones, doesn't know what happened to their children, their babies, their kids. That's painful. And so I want to reflect on that. I want to take a moment to reflect back to how painful that must be and how important it is to get those answers. So there are advocates that are pushing for this, pushing for the church to release those documents and to apologize, and that is important work, and that work must continue. The federal government right now, Canada, has so much that it needs to do. There is so much that Canada can do right now. And our focus right now is to get Canada to immediately take some steps. Right now, our focus is on getting Justin Trudeau to stop taking Indigenous kids to court. That's something we can do right now. Justin Trudeau has the power right now to tell those lawyers to stop, to call them off, to say, we're not going to continue this appeal. We're not going to continue to fight these kids. And we're not going to continue to fight a Canadian Human Rights Tribunal decision and multiple orders from the Human Rights Tribunal, where we can also have the Justin Trudeau immediately, right now, stop fighting residential school survivors in court. So those are some of the concrete things that we're calling for right now in our Opposition Day motion that will be debated tomorrow. And we're hoping to see some of these concrete actions from the Canadian government, from Justin Trudeau immediately. And the advocacy around the church and around the church's apology and around the documents being released will continue. And we're open to working with communities to see if there's additional ways we can apply pressure to achieve that result of getting the information and seeing an apology happen.
Next question on the phone, please.
Thank you. We have no more questions registered at this time. Nous n'avons plus de questions pour le moment.
We will now take a question in the room.
Good afternoon, Mr. Singh. Teresa Wright with the Canadian Press.
Good to see you.
I spoke with Justice Minister David Lametti, and he said that he would be willing to look at what legal avenues Canada or the federal government might have when it comes to protecting some of these residential school sites, whether it be from tampering or perhaps criminalizing those who would perhaps hide evidence. Do you think that goes far enough?
Well, the Canadian government and right now Justin Trudeau's government has not gone far enough at all. Like there's so many things that need to be done. Like the calls to action. That's one concrete thing. 6 years there have been these calls to action. This government has yet to implement them. That's a concrete thing they can do that they've yet to do. They are currently fighting these kids and the survivors in courts. Like they could stop doing that right now. That should be a question that we ask the Justice Minister. Why are Justin Trudeau and the Justice Minister sending lawyers to fight kids and survivors in court? That's something they should stop doing right now. And in terms of criminality, there's lots of questions about what would happen if another country in the world was faced with similar circumstance where kids were stripped from their homes and killed in what, and I feel very uncomfortable calling these residential schools when we know they weren't schools. That wasn't their goal. That wasn't what they were designed to do. In these institutions, there would be international investigation into that, and there would be criminal investigations into that. And there's a lot more that we can do, and a lot more that we need to do to get justice for Indigenous people. This moment right now is a moment where we are finally seeing a lot of people just feel the heavy toll of what residential schools meant to Indigenous people, what it meant to their families, and how that toll continues to have trauma and wreak havoc in people's lives. And I hope that this is a moment as a country that we say, okay, we need to now fight for justice for Indigenous people right now. The injustices that are going on right now, when people don't have access to their treaty rights and their land rights, that we have an opportunity now to right the wrongs. And that's what I'm hoping we do.
On your motion tomorrow, you have some pretty clear things that you're asking for, and you're asking for there to be a timeline for reporting. What are you willing? How far are you willing to go if the government doesn't do what you're asking? I mean, you're sometimes holding the balance of power, and you could use that lever. Are you willing to?
Yeah, we're always using our lever. We've used it throughout this pandemic to get more help to more people. And we're going to use every tool we have to fight to get justice for Indigenous people. That's why we're using the Opposition Day motion. That's one of the tools that we have. We're bringing this to debate tomorrow, and there'll be a vote on this. So we'll see which way the Liberal government votes. If their words were hollow and shallow when they talked about condolences for these 215 children that were found buried, these Indigenous children. We'll see if their words were hollow, if it was, again, just words and no commitment to action. So we'll see what this government does when given the opportunity. We have a vote that will be on this bill. We'll look very carefully to see where they vote. And we'll use every leverage we have to continue to fight for people, for Indigenous people, for the things that people need in this pandemic and in the recovery. We will continue to fight for people as we always have.
I'm just wondering, are you willing to trigger an election over this?
Well, the dilemma is the Liberal government wants an election. So really, how is that a lever? What we have a lever on is our ability to support legislation or not support legislation. If they want to pass a piece of legislation, they need our support, and we have used that leverage many times to get more help for people. In fact, doubling CERB, getting help to students, getting a paid sick leave, and bringing in an increased wage subsidy. All of these significant, some might say historic, and nothing has been done similarly in a generation, were all achieved not by forcing an election, but by withholding support on key legislation until we were able to obtain support. So the Liberal government is looking for an excuse to an election. We're not going to give an election in a pandemic, but we are certainly ready to use every tool we have to fight to get people the help they need.
Operatrice, do we have any other questions on the phone?
Yes, we do have a question from Cormac McSweeney from City News. Please go ahead. À vous la parole.
Yeah, I just want some clarification on the Catholic Church and the records. Do you think that it might be time, given the years that the Catholic Church has not released the records and we've not received the apology that Indigenous peoples are looking for, that it's time to take legal avenues for the government to try and get access to those records as a part of truth and reconciliation for those impacted by the residential school system?
I'm open to any path that will help get justice for Indigenous people. That includes legal action, includes pressure. I know that this is important, and this is important for Indigenous people, so I'm open to whatever we can do to support. But I will again want to make the point that there are so many steps that this government right now, Justin Trudeau is in power right now. There are so many steps that Canada still has not taken, implementing the calls to action, among many other steps. So I want to focus again on the steps that we can get done right now. Justin Trudeau is fighting kids in court. I can stop that. I can stop fighting survivors in court. So there's a lot that can be done right now immediately, but I am open to other avenues to help get Indigenous, help get answers, and release documents that Indigenous communities deserve to have access to.
The Crown Indigenous Relations Minister did have a message for Catholics at her news conference today and said that they need to tell their church that their church should do better. What's your message to Catholics in regards to what should happen with the church and these residential school records and the apology?
My message is directly to the leadership. This is an organization that has documents, should release the documents. This is an organization that is clearly implicated in a horrible act of genocide and has a responsibility to apologize and to make amends. So my message is directly to anyone involved. This government has a responsibility to not just apologize, but to make amends with clear, concrete action. And so my message is, if anyone is involved in the genocidal acts of the residential schools, they have a responsibility and an obligation to act and to fight for justice and to work in the interest of justice.
And we will now take another question in the room.
Thank you very much for indulging me. The Liberal government has at times responded to questions about national security in relation to China and the lab in Winnipeg by warning against stoking anti-Asian racism. How should political leaders balance concerns over China, whether on human rights violations or foreign policy, with concerns about rising incidents of racism and harassment at home?
I thought a lot about this, and I think it's really important that we are careful with our rhetoric. Of course, there is a role that we play as global citizens to raise concerns about human rights abuses going on around the world, and that is important. But there are ways for us to communicate that without dog whistle or without subtle, if sometimes even overt, language that is clearly stoking the flames of anti-Asian hate. And if I can just for a moment reflect on that, anti-Asian hate is real. It is hurting people. I have a constituent who I can't forget her words. She told me that her mom would go for evening walks. This is in the Lower Mainland in BC, would go for evening walks. And she told her mom, given the rise in violence against Asians, particularly people of Chinese descent, she told her mom, hey, don't go for walks in the evening anymore. I'm worried about you. For a daughter to be worried about her mom, an elderly woman potentially being attacked or facing violence because she's of Asian descent, that is horrible to have that conversation with your mom. That's what's going on. That's the real risk. And so it's very important not to belittle the concerns that language can promote hate. We've seen the focus on China and using language that stokes hate, increasing hate towards people of Chinese descent and Asians. That is a real threat. That is a real concern. And we have to be vigilant that does not enter into the public discourse, that we can criticize the track record of a country or raise concerns about human rights, and we should. People should raise concerns about our human rights track record as well. But we have to do it in a way that does not stoke any of the very real and present hatred that is already brewing.
And I'll check one last time on the phone. Impératrice, nous avons une autre question.
Nous n'avons plus de questions pour le moment.
Thank you. And this concludes today's press conference.
Thank you very much. Thanks.